1865. The United States had just concluded a devastating civil war. By the dawn of the 20th century, America will have become a world power. But first, the groundwork had to be laid. Industrialization exploded, ushering in a period of confidence and optimism that would define the American character. U.S. territory spilled out into the Caribbean and Pacific in a burst of expansionism, forcing the U.S. to grapple with its new role as an imperial power. A course that would define America in the 20th century. European nations had long established imperial colonies. The British in India, the French in Indochina, the Spanish in the Pacific and the Caribbean. In the 19th century, they turned their attention to Africa, carving it up. Eventually, only Liberia and Ethiopia were left as independent countries. Russia had even crossed the Bering Strait and established a foothold on the North American continent. It was in this competitive climate that the United States found itself. There were citizens who believed that if the U.S. did not join the land rush, it would lose out. What was the interest in expansion? There were three reasons. The most important was economic. During the Civil War, the U.S. had greatly increased its production of manufactured products, dictating a desire to find new markets abroad and a need for more raw materials. The second reason was military strength. Some believed that if the U.S. lacked powerful armed forces, it would not be able to defend its economic interests. The third reason was the belief in the racial superiority of Anglo-Saxons, white people of English descent, especially the British and their American cousins. In the late 1800s, many British and Americans believed it was the white race's God-given duty to civilize and Christianize the so-called inferior peoples of the world. British writer Rudyard Kipling's poem, The White Man's Burden, appeared in McClure's magazine, romanticizing this idea.
Take up the white man's burden, send for the best ye breed. Go, bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need. To wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new-caught, sullen peoples, half devil and half child.
The expansionist philosophy was far from universal. A group of educators, writers, and social activists who called themselves anti-imperialists opposed expansion. They believed that imperialism was a threat to the American value system, that a democracy should not keep other countries in servitude. Activist Jane Addams castigated Kipling.
To protect the weak has always been the excuse of the ruler and tax gatherer, the chief, the king, the baron, and now at last of the white man.
The anti-imperialists also highlighted practical issues, the huge cost of maintaining army and navy, and the fear that expansion would take jobs away from U.S. workers. The late 19th century saw three particularly key expansionist events that set an imperialist mood for the 20th century. Among the staunchest advocates of expansionism was Matthew Colbert Perry, a career Navy man. Perry recommended that the United States take active measures to secure a number of ports in the Pacific where they could refuel their coal-burning steamships. The island nation of Japan seemed ideal. There was one major problem. Japan had been closed to foreigners for over 200 years. In the summer of 1853, loaded with cannon, Commodore Matthew Perry's flotilla sailed into Edo Harbor, the gateway to Japan's imperial city. In a rosewood box wrapped in silk, Perry delivered a letter from President Fillmore asking the Japanese to open trade, to give fair treatment to shipwrecked sailors, and allow the U.S. the opportunity to refuel in Japanese ports. Along with the president's letter, Perry sent a cautionary one of his own.
Many of the large ships of war destined to visit Japan have not yet arrived in these seas, though they are hourly expected.
Perry's expedition wintered on the China coast, then returned in February with 8 heavily armed battleships. The threat of force proved to be enough to persuade the Japanese. On March 31, 1854, a treaty was signed that granted Fillmore's requests, opening the ports of Japan for trade with the U.S. Matthew Perry's gunboat diplomacy sounded a wake-up call for Japan, spurring them to strengthen their navy and modernize their nation. Another method of attaining territory was to buy it. In debt from the disastrous Crimean War, Imperial Russia was open to selling their territory across the Bering Strait, Russian Alaska. Its vast untamed wilderness was ridiculed as a dreary waste of glaciers, ice, white bears, and walruses. But U.S. Secretary of State William H. Seward had his eye on this piece of property since 1860. Seward saw Alaska's strategic value for trade or in the event of war. He also pictured potential in Alaska's resources, especially timber and furs. Seward was so eager to secure Alaska, he entered into negotiations with the Russian envoy, the Baron Eduard de Steckel, without the go-ahead of the President or Congress. On March 30, 1867, Seward and de Steckel signed the Treaty of Cessation. The U.S. agreed to purchase Alaska from the Russians for $7.2 million, only 2.5 cents an acre, though Congress had yet to approve a single cent for the deal. Few Americans viewed Alaska as a bargain. The press mocked the purchase as Seward's folly and Seward's icebox. But nearly 1 year later, and after much political wrangling, the U.S. Treasury finally wrote the check, and Alaska became a U.S. territory. While the acquisition of Alaska was a cordial affair, other expansionist yearnings proved more troubling. Such was the case in Hawaii. In the early 1800s, missionaries from New England made the arduous journey to Hawaii to spread Christianity. They misinterpreted the Hawaiian culture, believing that living in a paradise had kept the Hawaiians from progressing.
Instead of grasping all he can get, he divides with his neighbor and confidently expects his neighbor to divide with him.
While the native Hawaiians were content to live in their traditional ways, a growing influx of Americans was busily building huge plantations, railways, docks, and hotels. They soon dominated the island's economy and made their influence felt in government. In January 1891, Hawaii's native king, Kalakaua, died, and his sister, Liliuokalani, ascended to the throne. Although she was educated in the U.S., she rallied against U.S. rule. Hawaii for Hawaiians. In 1893, American plantation owners plotted a revolt with the help of U.S. Ambassador John L. Stevens. When the U.S. battleship Boston arrived, Queen Liliuokalani saw that resistance was hopeless and sadly surrendered her throne. The Americans assembled their own government, with Sanford B. Dole as the president. U.S. Ambassador John L. Stevens reported to Washington.
The Hawaiian pear is now fully ripe, and this is the golden hour for the United States to pluck it.
President Grover Cleveland, however, opposed the annexation of a sovereign nation and tried in vain to restore Liliuokalani to the throne. After William McKinley became president, Hawaii was annexed in 1898. In 1901, the influential Admiral Alfred T. Mahan became a military advisor to President McKinley. Mahan was best known for his book, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, 1660 to 1783. In it, he illustrated how a nation's power is directly related to its naval might. He advocated updating the U.S. Navy fleet, establishing Caribbean naval bases, building a canal across the Isthmus of Panama, and increasing U.S. possessions in the Pacific. The second half of the 19th century found Spain holding tenuously to their empire. Cuba and Puerto Rico in the Caribbean, the Philippines and Guam in the Pacific. Meanwhile, in the U.S., the expansionist mood was at a fever pitch, with U.S. investments in Cuban sugar and mining industries steadily rising. In 1870, young Cuban Jose Marti had his first success as a rebel. He penned a patriotic poem against Spanish rule. The poem angered the Spanish government in Cuba so much, they jailed Marti for 4 months and sent him into exile. Unthwarted, Marti continued his political writing, calling for Cuban independence.
It is terrible to speak of you, liberty, for one who lives without you. A wild beast does not bend its knee before its tamer with greater fury.
His tenacious spirit provided the Cuban people a national hero and hope of ending colonial rule. In 1894, Marti organized guerrilla actions, destroying U.S.-owned sugarcane plantations, hoping to provoke U.S. intervention in the Cuban plight against Spain. Spain sent an army under General Valeriano Weyler to crush the rebellion. Jose Marti was killed, but his revolution blazed on. Frustrated by rebel successes, General Weyler ordered 300,000 Cuban civilians into concentration camps. Thousands died, and the revolution seemed lost. But aid for Cuba arrived from some unlikely allies. Rival newspaper publishers William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer printed stories about the butcher Weyler. Not out of any democratic zeal, the stories simply bolstered newspaper sales. They tried to outdo each other by printing sensational pictures and stories that fed the hysteria against Spain. Embellished stories like this became known as yellow journalism. Painter Frederick Remington was among the many reporters sent to cover the war. In 1897, Remington arrived in Havana to find there were no battles, no cavalry charges, and no artillery barrages. With no story to cover, he wired Hearst.
Everything is quiet. There is no trouble. There will be no war. I wish to return.
Some say Hearst replied, "Please remain. You furnish the pictures, and I will furnish the war." And war did come. On January 25, 1898, the USS Maine steamed into Havana Harbor. Outwardly, its mission was to help quell the conflict between the Cubans and Spanish. On February 15, 1898, Captain Charles Sigsbee was in his cabin after dinner. His crew was below decks. Suddenly, an explosion ripped through the underbelly of the Maine, killing 266 men. The American headline screamed, "It was a Spanish mine." "Remember the Maine" became a rallying cry as the American public was whipped into a frenzy. While the U.S. Congress prepared a declaration of war against Spain, forces were deployed to the Caribbean and the Pacific. Anti-expansionists protested loudly. They believed the U.S. was in danger of becoming an imperialist nation. U.S. Navy warships moved in to blockade the harbor of Havana, Cuba's capital. And President McKinley issued a call for 125,000 volunteers. Infuriated, Spain declared war on the U.S. 2 days later, on April 25th, the U.S. reciprocated. On the other side of the world, in the Pacific, Commodore George Dewey received orders to seek the Spanish fleet and capture or destroy it. The Philippines had been oppressed by the Spanish crown for more than 400 years, provoking many revolutions. When the U.S. declared war on Spain, Filipino rebel Emilio Aguinaldo saw a way for the Philippines to achieve independence. On May 1st, Dewey surprised the Spanish fleet in Manila Bay and sank all 10 Spanish ships. During the next 3 months, some 11,000 U.S. troops joined with the Filipino rebels to defeat the Spanish. Aguinaldo declared Philippine independence on June 12th. With the Philippines seemingly under control, U.S. troops moved on to capture Guam. Meanwhile, back in the Caribbean, the 9th Cavalry, a unit of African-American soldiers, arrived in Cuba. They found the Army quartermasters totally unprepared for the thousands of troops pouring in. Equipment was disorganized. They were issued woolen uniforms in the tropical heat. Both black and white soldiers were forced to live in unsanitary conditions with poor rations. Diseases such as yellow fever broke out, and thousands were hospitalized. Of the 5,400 deaths in the Cuban campaign, only 379 were the result of combat. Teddy Roosevelt quit his desk job as Secretary of the Navy and became second in command of a volunteer regiment called the Rough Riders. They were a motley crew of some 1,200 men, including the socially prominent, cowboys, musicians, and clerks. In a critical battle, Teddy Roosevelt led the Rough Riders on a charge up Kettle Hill. They came under heavy fire, but were aided by the 2 regiments of African-American soldiers. They sacked Kettle Hill, but at great cost.
What a sight was presented as I recrossed the flat in front of San Juan. The dead and wounded soldier. It was indescribable.
In short order, the U.S. captured San Juan Hill and seized the Spanish fort, while destroying Cuban ships in the Straits of Havana. With the situation in hand in Cuba and the Pacific, the U.S. now turned 18,000 troops and a naval escort on another Spanish colony in the Caribbean, Puerto Rico. They landed at Guanica Bay, but before they could reach the capital city, Spain agreed to sign a peace treaty with the United States, putting an end to all military hostilities. The war was over in just 4 months. The truce with Spain was signed on August 12, 1898. It was a splendid little war, commented soon-to-be Secretary of State John Hay. It may have been a splendid little war, but it left a distasteful legacy. On December 10, 1898, the Treaty of Paris was signed, giving the United States the right to occupy Cuba with full control over Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. In the Philippines, Emilio Aguinaldo and his supporters were angered as one colonial power was replaced with another. On February 4, 1899, he declared war on the U.S. forces in the islands. It was a brutal war of massacre and torture, with U.S. forces taking on an ugly role, forcing Filipino civilians to live in areas where disease, hunger, and poor sanitation killed thousands, much as the Spanish under Butcher Weyler did in Cuba. In the end, more than 20,000 Filipino rebels and some 4,000 Americans were dead. At home, anti-imperialists complained that the war's purpose was to free Spain's colonies, but the result was the U.S. becoming an imperial power. The famed American writer Mark Twain sarcastically noted,
"There must be 2 Americas, one that sets the captive free and one that takes the once captive's new freedom away."
Ultimately, the U.S. Supreme Court decided how new territories would be handled. Puerto Rico became an incorporated territory, allowing Puerto Ricans to become U.S. citizens and the right to vote on statehood. On the other hand, the Philippines remained unincorporated. In 1902, Filipinos held elections for their House of Representatives, a first step on their long journey toward independence. While the Filipinos were struggling to gain independence in the Pacific, a similar battle was being waged in the Caribbean. In 1900, the Cubans wrote a constitution. Fearful that another country would dominate Cuban affairs, the U.S. Congress insisted that Cubans add provisions known as the Platt Amendment, which limited Cuba's rights to make treaties, and permitted the U.S. to send troops into Cuba to keep order. Cuba became a protectorate of the United States. As the 20th century opened, China was in turmoil. Corruption was widespread. Opium addiction was endemic. Rebellion, drought, and famine claimed the lives of 60 million Chinese. Foreign nations had divvied up the empire into spheres of influence, areas where one country had exclusive rights to trade, invest, and had special political rights. With a coaling base in the Philippines just 400 miles from China, American businesses hoped to take advantage of China's vast resources and sell to her vast market. John Hay, then U.S. Secretary of State, had a brilliant idea. He sent letters to all the foreign powers suggesting an open-door policy in China. This policy would help U.S. businesses by guaranteeing equal trading rights for all, preventing one nation from discriminating against another. At the same time, the open-door policy maintained the territorial integrity of China, an idea that appealed to anti-imperialists at home. Other powers politely put Hay off, saying that while an open-door policy is a good idea in principle, they had no way of enforcing it. However, Hay, despite the debate, boldly announced that everyone had agreed to the policy. Everyone, that is, except China. Cixi, Empress Dowager of the Qing dynasty, was eager to rid her empire of these foreigners. In northern Shandong province, a secret society known as the Fists of Righteous Harmony attracted thousands of followers. They, too, wanted to rid China of foreign influences, but they also sought to throw off the yoke of the corrupt Chinese government. Foreigners called members of this society boxers because they practiced martial arts. Boxers believed that through meditation and discipline, they could cloak themselves in a mystical shield, so foreign bullets could not harm them. The Empress welcomed the boxers as China's defenders and turned their fury squarely against the foreign community. In June 1900, the boxers began their bloody campaign. They murdered hundreds of foreign missionaries and Chinese Christian converts, destroying millions of dollars worth of property. About 900 foreigners blockaded themselves in their embassies for nearly 2 months, repelling waves of boxers.
Ammunition, food, and medical supplies were almost gone. Then shortly before dawn, loud explosions rocked the city. Weary defenders staggered to the barricades expecting a final, overpowering boxer attack.
But instead, relief had arrived. Troops from Britain, France, Germany, Japan, and the U.S. fought their way into Peking to free their countrymen and put down the rebellion. The boxers, believing they were impervious to bullets, were cut down by the thousands. On September 7, 1901, China and 11 other nations signed the Boxer Protocol, snuffing out the rebellion. Foreign policy at the turn of the century was characterized by 3 vastly different philosophies: Theodore Roosevelt's big stick diplomacy, William Taft's dollar diplomacy, and Woodrow Wilson's moral diplomacy. Theodore Roosevelt abided by the African proverb, "Speak softly and carry a big stick." He applied this big stick theory to American foreign policy, believing the U.S. should take a strong role in Asia. In 1905, Roosevelt intervened to end the war between Russia and Japan over Korea and Manchuria. When Japan was angered by racist sentiment in the U.S., Roosevelt arranged a gentleman's agreement. He would see that Asian discrimination ended, but in turn, Japan would have to limit Japanese immigration to the U.S. In a show of growing U.S. naval might, Roosevelt launched 16 warships on a world tour. Painted brilliant white, the flotilla was known as the Great White Fleet. The tour was a triumph. The U.S. was regarded as the most potent naval power after the British. In the interest of connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, Roosevelt turned his attention to a narrow strip of land in Colombia, the Isthmus of Panama. In 1903, Roosevelt's Secretary of State John Hay failed in an attempt to negotiate a treaty with Colombia for the land. But U.S. interests were not to be denied. Roosevelt backed a Panamanian revolt and negotiated for the Panama Canal zone. Work began. Massive locks were designed to raise ships through the mountains and then lower them on the other side. 1.53 million cubic meters of concrete were poured, 70,000 workers recruited, and $400 million was spent. A marvelous engineering achievement, the canal was finally completed in 1914, just in time for World War I. In 1904, Roosevelt wielded his big stick again, adding a corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Initiated in 1823, the Monroe Doctrine established a policy to limit European expansion into the Western Hemisphere. Roosevelt's corollary went further. It stated that the U.S. had the right to intervene militarily to keep European powers out of the Western Hemisphere. The Roosevelt corollary was exercised the very next year in 1905 in order to relieve the Dominican Republic's debt to threatening foreign creditors. In 1909, when William Howard Taft succeeded Roosevelt as president, he established a foreign policy encouraging U.S. investment in Latin America and China as a way of discouraging European investment. In contrast to Roosevelt's big stick policy, this new policy became known as dollar diplomacy. As a result, U.S.-owned businesses came to dominate the economies of many small nations in Central America, the Caribbean, and parts of South America. Latin Americans reacted with anger and resentment, but they were powerless in the face of the U.S. military. In 1913, Woodrow Wilson succeeded Taft as president. Wilson offered yet another approach to foreign policy. He rejected big stick and dollar diplomacy in favor of a moral diplomacy, applying a moral standard and not recognizing any government that is undemocratic or hostile to U.S. interests. To protect U.S. business interests, Wilson rallied troops to stabilize Haiti, the Dominican Republic, and Cuba, effectively turning them into U.S. protectorates. Wilson encountered failure in his dealings with Mexico. In the late 19th century, corruption in Mexico was prevalent, escalating with the assassination of Mexico's president, Francisco Madero, in 1913, and the assumption of power by Victoriano Huerta. Not wanting to support a government by murder, Wilson refused to dignify Huerta's government.
I am going to teach the South American republics to elect good men.
President Wilson mobilized U.S. Marines to capture the port of Veracruz in Mexico. Although split over allegiance to Huerta, Mexicans were united in their opposition to U.S. invasion, and war was barely averted between the two countries. In 1916, when Mexican rebel Pancho Villa raided a U.S. border town and killed U.S. citizens, an expeditionary force of 11,000 men, under the leadership of General John J. Pershing, crossed into Mexico to hunt for Villa. After a year-long pursuit, Pershing's expedition was called off, but the affair increased anti-American sentiments. U.S. troops withdrew in 1917, and tensions eventually eased between Mexico and the U.S. The United States forcibly entered the new century as an imperial power. In little more than a century, a nation founded on freedom discovered itself embroiled in troubling relationships with the peoples of its new territories and protectorates. Despite the turmoil, America had forged from its historic isolation a newborn world power.
Thank you.